Hello, everyone, and welcome to another week of Record Live. Last week on the show, we mentioned that we really enjoy having people recommend guests and recommend topics because sometimes Jared and I don't know what to talk about on a Wednesday afternoon. And our guest today, Olivia Morton, was one of those recommendations, which is pretty cool. So, Jared, welcome to the show again. And Olivia, thank you for coming on Record Live.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks,
How
Anita.
you going, Jared? All right. Olivia, you're good?
Yeah. I'm always excited to be at Record Live. You know, these are great. And shout out to one of our colleagues who actually heard Olivia speak at, I believe I was going to say college church. It's University Church, isn't it now? Avondale University Church. And they really liked what you had to say so much that they came back and told us and said, hey, this was a really good topic. This was really interesting. You guys should think about this topic for an article or for the show or something like that. So that came about really nicely, and I love seeing that sort of happen. So yeah, we're excited to have you on, Olivia.
Oh, awesome. I'm really excited to have a chat with you guys today.
Awesome. Now, Olivia, I know you're a bit of a juggler of roles and responsibilities and things. I was talking to you before we started recording this, and you were just telling me some of the things you're involved in. So before we get into the conversation, which I'm sure many people will be able to relate to you, but can you just tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do, both in like the workspace and also in the kind of volunteer church capacity?
Yeah, sure. So I'm actually a full-time student. So I'm studying at Avondale University to be a secondary teacher. With a major in history teaching and like a minor in chaplaincy. But my real passion area is working with particularly young people in the church space. So obviously I attend University Church on the Avondale campus. I've actually done that since I was a little kid. So unlike a lot of the students, I'm here year round. And yeah, we have a really cool space for a lot of youth and teens. We have quite a large youth group at the church, and I get to hang out with them. Spend a lot of time with them, organize socials for them. So I'm basically just the youth and teens leader there. But as you mentioned, Zita, I also am an RA in the girls' dorms on the Avondale campus and do a little bit in the regional youth and young adult space for our Lake Macquarie area. We organize these things called fireside rallies, which are essentially youth rallies for our high school students that span from Walls End kind of area, so Macquarie College, Newcastle, down to Central Coast. So I don't know, I just love working particularly with young people, but just in any kind of space where we're facilitating different groups of people meeting up and worshipping together.
Awesome. I feel like full-time studying on its own is a lot, so kudos for doing all that other stuff on top of it. But obviously in your presentation, or in your sermon, I should say, you talked about burnout and how that's like a common experience. And I'm guessing, you're doing a lot of things and you have a lot of responsibilities. And you said that this was your first sermon there that you'd preached on. And so I'm guessing it's something that you kind of have experienced or have a story in. Have you personally kind of come up against burnout, or have you had a moment where you've been doing all these things in ministry and you felt burnout? Or like, what is the story behind why you were so passionate about this topic?
I feel like as somebody who struggles to say no to things a lot of the time, sometimes out of like, I feel like I'm obligated to do things, but often, more often than not, I'm just excited to be a part of lots of different spaces. I think that burnout's something that I have come up against quite a few times, but I do have one particular period of my life that I can remember kind of really having to stop and say, okay, I need to take a bit of a stock take here and figure out what I'm going to do. And it was driving home from our second ever youth rally that we ran out of the Fireside, under the Fireside name. And I was driving home at about 11:30 at night. I just finished packing up pretty much on my own. And my tank was on, I think, like I'd been on empty for the whole day. So I was getting a bit worried that I wasn't going to make it home. My phone was on 1%. And I just looked at both of those pretty much empty measures and said, okay, that's how I'm feeling myself right now as well. And I remember going home and having a big sleep, and I woke up the next morning and just had this overwhelming feeling that something needed to change in the space. And while I still wanted to be a massive part of what we were doing, I knew that there had to be something that I could do so that these things would continue to run and be successful without me feeling like I was on the brink of burnout.
That's interesting experience. Thank you for sharing that. people often think that when you're in your passion area, you can't get burnt out. So you've mentioned that this was a real passion area for you, and yet you were feeling like it was depleting you. Can you explore that a little bit with us? It seems to be a misconception that people have. How is it that you continued to be involved, continued to be passionate about that space, but also set in place? It sounds like you went on to maybe set some boundaries or to try and figure out how to be involved without depleting yourself to that point again. So can you tell us a little bit about that part of the journey?
Yeah, absolutely. So something, so as you mentioned, Jared, youth spaces and particularly our youth rallies that we've been running was something that were incredibly close to my heart. I'd been a part of the team that had kind of started this from the ground, and it was something that I just felt so passionate about making sure that it continued happening. But for me, I think one of the reasons that I think we can get a little bit, as you mentioned, there's a bit of a misconception out there that if we're in our passion areas, then it means that we're not going to get burnt out in any capacity because it's filling us. But I think we still need to acknowledge that if we're not doing those things in a healthy way, having those healthy boundaries, and particularly having a support network around us, that's where those things can start to become, while they're still feeding into us, they are still actually quite a burden. We live in a society at the moment where our time is so valuable. And when you have a massive passion for any kind of area, you're going to give a lot of your time towards that. And I think we need to do that as a true, it's a gift that we're giving back to the people around us, and a gift that we're giving back to God, because we're acknowledging that he's the one that's given us these talents. But we do need to acknowledge that when you give something away, you don't have that thing at your disposal anymore. When we give a lot of our time towards these things that we're passionate about, there are going to be some kinds of repercussions, which are going to be that we have less time to give to other areas. And for me, that was my study, that was investing in some of the relationships that I had around me. And that's when I started to feel like I'm really giving a lot of myself to this area, but I need to be careful because there are other areas that I also need to continue to invest in to be a well-rounded and healthy individual.
Yeah, I think even the things that like are really important that we have in life, like balance, like even relationships, relationships are probably the most important thing. But then it's like if we don't balance that with other things in our life, then even like, this sounds really weird for me to be saying this, but like even all of our time in relationships is like imbalanced, I suppose. But you've mentioned that like burnout is like, obviously when we're doing things we love, like if we're doing our jobs and they're our passions, we might experience burnout. But you mentioned that burnout is something that is being experienced a lot like within churches, and I assume that's not just with people who have like official roles, but also people who are just like working in some like whatever capacity that they're passionate about. Is this something that we are seeing like more of today or less of today? Because I would assume that after COVID that people are a bit more chill, people have had some time to relax, and that it might have given people a period to like kind of reignite that passion, rest, and kind of get back into things. But is that the case, or are we seeing the opposite?
I think that's exactly what we've been seeing post-COVID. And so when I was given this topic as obviously the topic of my sermon that I was going to preach, I was drawing off a lot of what I'd seen in my church. Obviously, University Church is quite a large Adventist church in Australia. And we had a lot of people pre-COVID who would be really involved with a lot of our ministries and the even just the different elements of church life and church programming. And I had noticed coming back from COVID that was still like there was still quite a large population of our church that was really involved in doing the either whether it's outreach or life groups or anything like that. But I had noticed that it wasn't quite as strong as it had been before the lockdown. And so I realized that I couldn't just go off my own experience. I actually did have to go and find a little bit of research to back up what I was saying. Something that I did find, one study was saying that the average percentage of congregation members, so as you mentioned, Zanita, not just pastors and church volunteers who were in some kind of paid role, but the average percentage of the congregation that volunteers within the church pre-COVID was about 40%. And after COVID, they were noticing that it had dropped down by half to about 20% of your congregation volunteering to be involved in some capacity. And I think this is just my perspective. I think that's for a couple of reasons. I think firstly, a lot of people after COVID, as you mentioned, did actually take that step back and said, hey, we need to take inventory of what's happening in our lives. Life has become so busy between work, if you're a parent looking after your kids, study, whatever that may be in your life. Sometimes we get to the weekend and we just want a Sabbath rest. And that's totally not a bad thing. That's something that obviously God instructs us to do. But I do think on top of that, we've also seen a real shift where, because we have such amazing pastors and volunteers in our church that are in a paid capacity, sometimes congregation members can sit back a little bit and think, oh, I'm not sure I want to get involved in this. They're being paid to do it. And if I get involved, I'm going to have to give too much of my time, which I don't have, which I do also think relates back to that whole idea that we're just scared of burning out. If we give ourselves to too much, we're scared that there's no succession plan. And then when we commit to being part of something, we're committing to do it for the rest of our lives. And that can be a bit overwhelming.
So here's the $1 million question, I suppose, with what we're talking about today. It sounds like that you have a passion to see, I guess, mentoring and relationships developed within that context. So especially succession plans, who are you passing the keys to? Who are you developing? Who are you helping to learn and to understand and to grow in that area? Some people might see that as an extra add-on. So it's easy enough to do my job, but if I have to teach someone else at the same time as doing it, that's extra for me. Can you break down some of that? Why do you think that actually, because it's sort of a unique concept, I'm not sure I've heard it quite framed in the way you've put it before, mentoring can help you to avoid burnout? Like, how does that gel together?
I think, yeah, that absolutely hits the nail on the head. The example that I use is teaching a teenager to drive. And so I told a story as part of my sermon about when my mum first was teaching me to drive when I was on my learners. It's actually a very stressful experience for everyone involved. And I'm sure that those listening, if you've taught somebody how to drive before on their learners, it is a really stressful experience that is often a lot easier if you just drive home instead. And there was this one specific example that I shared where we were driving home from a sports game that we'd been watching. And on the way home, there was rain, there was fog, there were kangaroos on the side of the road, and it was nighttime. And I was really overwhelmed at the principle of having to drive home in these conditions for the first time. And while it would have been much easier for my mum, who was in the passenger seat, to just say, pull over, I'm just going to take over and you can just sit in the front and just relax. While that would have been a lot easier for her, she knew that in the long run, teaching me to drive would mean that she could then enable me to do things for her down the line. So now, obviously, I'm 21. I've had my license for a couple of years. Mum can say things to me like, hey, I really need you to go pick this up. Can you drive and go and get it without having to go with me? And I think that same principle can be applied in our local churches, whether that is sound and lighting is a great example, whether that is identifying a young person who wants to learn those skills and actually taking the time. And yeah, you're right, Jade, it is actually a lot of extra time to then do your job while also turning to somebody else and teaching them how to do it. But knowing that in the long run, that means that one day you're actually able to step away from that position and know that it's in good hands. I think it's one of those situations where you know that in the long run, you're actually going to gain more than you give. And I think not only is it a great way for us to have leaders that aren't worried about stepping away and aren't worried as much about their own burnout, it also means that we know we have a healthy church that's going to continue to grow and continue to be sustainable once we step away.
Yeah, I think it's good. It means that you're not like stepping away from a role feeling guilty as well. It's like you know that there's kind of someone else under you. But I like the example that you gave of Jesus feeding the 5,000, where you were kind of like he really like used the disciples. He could have literally just been like, I'm just going to miraculously whip up some food and I'm not going to go to a child and I'm not going to get the disciples to hand out the stuff. But he intentionally was like, I'm going to go find a little boy who has something and I'm going to ask the disciples to go walk around and the people will thank them for food. Like he didn't have to do that. And that was like more out of his way than it would have been to just like go bang, here's like 5,000 loaves or however many. But I think that's a really cool example of like oh, we can do things the easier way, but like if we do that, then in the long term, like we're not going to have people who can do it themselves or who have that like confidence to do things themselves or that motivation to do things themselves. But yeah, so I just think that's a really cool example as well that you mentioned. But I guess you mentioned obviously there's like people like sound, but in your own experience, what are some of the other ways that people have kind of like mentored you, or what are some ways that people in different roles at churches can kind of like, you know, someone might be like, I didn't even know what it looks like to mentor someone. Like, how do I actually do that? Do I have to be like a motivational Tony Robbins kind of character, or like, can I just be anyone? And like, what does that look like, I guess, in different situations?
I think that can look like a different, obviously we can incorporate mentorship into a variety of different spaces as our church. And I think that obviously Jesus is our best example for anything. And the way that Jesus mentors the disciples in the story of him feeding the 5,000, I think really nails it on the head. The main takeaways, I would say, is just getting somebody to walk alongside you and witness the ways that you do things. So whether that is as a singer, so I come from a music background. I remember the first time that I was invited to sing as part of our church, just worship service. I didn't sing any kind of part by myself. I wasn't, no one was standing there going, all right, and then we're going to do this, and then we're going to do this. Just being there in that space as somebody who was, I think, maybe 11 at the time, with all of these college students and mums and dads that were all involved in this worship program, just being allowed to be a part of that space and watch what they were doing was such a massive learning experience for me. And I think that is one of the reasons we see the disciples just walking alongside Jesus constantly in the Bible. So yeah, in the singing space, whether you're catering, one of our hospitality managers at church, we have a high school boy who's in grade 11 this year who loves cooking. He's a phenomenal cook. He is constantly welcomed to be a part of our catering team whenever we're doing a church potluck or something like that. And there's not really somebody that's particularly right up alongside him and constantly telling him what to do. They kind of just give him a little bit of his space and let him fail as well. I think that's a massive part of mentoring. And also goes back to your point, Jared, of when we have leaders who are trying to teach someone else how to do something, part of the stress and the extra workload that comes with that can be alleviated if we don't try to micromanage the person that we're mentoring. So if I'm trying to teach somebody else how to organize an event or how to sing at church, if I'm constantly telling them every little detail of what they have to do, instead of just letting them maybe make a few mistakes or even not make a mistake, but just do something differently to how I would have initially chose to do it, by letting them do this, do whatever it is that I'm empowering them to do, on their own terms with some guidance, but not micromanaging, I actually also alleviate some of the burden that I feel I have to contribute to whatever it is that I've entrusted them to do.
I think that's a great point. And as you were talking, actually, in answering the past couple of questions, I'm just reminded I've been reading recently the story of Elijah, rereading the story of Elijah, and one of the classic examples we bring up when it comes to burnout in the Bible, Elijah was having that moment of almost pity party, saying, woe is me, like, take my life, Lord. I've tried all these things. I'm alone. I'm isolated, nothing. And God's response there is really, really interesting. Gives him a feed, gives him a nap. 40 days he walks to Sinai and whatnot. And then he's there and God asks him, why are you here? What's the issue? And Elijah pours out his heart. He says all these things that are the problem. And then God doesn't directly answer his question. He actually gives him a plan to go anoint a couple of kings and to anoint Elisha, his successor, to start that mentoring process. It's really interesting to me now. It's all sort of coming together in our conversation that God goes and addresses Elijah's burnout with a mentoring solution. I've never sort of seen it until recently quite that clearly that was actually addressing that. So we do have definitely, I think, and your example of Jesus as well is another good example of biblical examples of why mentoring is important and how it works in the spiritual journey that we're living in. not so much a question, but just an observation. Maybe you've got some reflections on that story also.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the I love how you said that God doesn't directly answer his question, but he obviously provides almost a solution, but in that God way where he gives you something that you didn't know that you needed. He provides Elijah with Elisha as someone to mentor, but also that Elijah knows that he's not alone. And sorry, I was just pulling up on my phone in 1 Kings in the story when Elijah actually approaches God and God asks him, what's wrong? One of the big key points that Elijah drills home is that I'm the only one left.
Yes.
Everyone else around me is clearly not doing the right thing, and I feel like I'm completely alone. And I feel like oftentimes when we're looking at people who are facing burnout, and even from my own experience, that overwhelming feeling of I've got to do this by myself, and I'm the one that's kind of bearing that burden. And I think by providing somebody to mentor, I think we can often feel that mentoring is a system where the mentor is the one that's giving and the person who's being mentored is the one that's gaining. But I actually think it's a mutually beneficial relationship. I don't know if you guys have seen on the ABC, there's a couple of programs where they will bring troubled teenagers to meet with older people who are in retirement village kind of situations. And every time one of those episodes finishes, the point that they drill home is that intergenerational connection is vital for a healthy individual. And we know that, like we see in the Bible countless times, the point that's really drilled home is that we're supposed to live in community. And so mentorship is not something where Elisha, for example, the person being mentored, is the one gaining everything in this situation. And that then Elijah is giving a lot of himself, like out of a really charitable deed, but not really getting anything in return. And obviously that's not why we choose to mentor someone, but I do think it's really important to acknowledge that those that choose to mentor someone else are actually also going to gain often a friend or somebody to work alongside and a bit of a community around them. I even think of one of the men at our church, one of the dads, he runs the live stream, and his entire team of people on the cameras are now teenage boys or college students that he's been able to really invest in. But it's also meant that he doesn't have to do it every week and that he doesn't have to sit there on a camera by himself. He has all the people around him instead. And I just think that when we look at mentorship, I can really see how it's actually part of God's design for us to live in community and to feed into each other in a way that's not only really soul-filling and beneficial, but also really sustainable for our church.
Yeah, it's awesome. I think we've looked at this on Record Live before, but they've done heaps of studies where they've shown like the thing that actually draws people to churches is not necessarily like the fancy program and the good speakers. It's like the intergenerational relationships and that nurturing kind of atmosphere, which is, pretty awesome. But I guess maybe just to like devil's advocate for a second, you've obviously talked about how a lot of people have this experience where they maybe experience the gospel for the first time, or they're like a fresh Christian and they have this like, I don't know, almost like this excitement to get involved and to do something and to like volunteer or whatever it is. Like, and I can definitely testify this. When I came back to church, I was like so excited and so like I wanted to do so many things, and I had this passion and this just this like, I don't even know what you'd call it, excitement, I guess, but somewhere along that line, like you were saying, I felt like I was doing it all and I felt like I was the only one. And that's like kind of like a common experience. Like people are kind of like, I'm doing all this stuff, but like there's no one here doing it with me. And I guess like for me at least, I find myself now like kind of wanting to get more involved in church, but also afraid because I'm like, I don't want to get involved and then find myself kind of like disappointed again because it's like I'm carrying the weight on my own. And so I guess for people who like maybe are newer to the faith, or for people who like feel like they need a mentor, not so much that they are in the space to mentor someone else, what would you kind of like advise them? Like how do you just like go and ask someone, or like what if you feel like you need that mentor versus like you need to be sowing into someone else?
That's a really good point. I think I've had a couple of situations. I've actually been very blessed to be a part of a church community for a very long time. But I have had a couple of situations where I've gone up to somebody that I really admire and said, hey, can you actually help me with this? Or can you teach me how to do this? In fact, I think I had one situation where I walked up to one of the young mums in our church and said to her, "Hey, would you be willing to just chat with me about life?" It was a very vague question. She actually stopped and was like, "Are you asking me to be a bit of a mentor for you?" And I was like, "I actually am. I just don't know how to say that." I would say that a lot of our older generations, particularly, are often the ones that feel a little bit unwanted in our newer church. I'd speak to obviously I go to university church. We're quite a young church because we have a very large contingent of college students that attend week to week. But in talking with some of our more grey-haired members, a lot of the time they feel like they don't have as much of a place in some of our younger churches. And to have somebody go up to them and say, "Hey, can you teach me how to do this?" Whether it's a really practical church related thing, like, "Hey, can you teach me how to organize someone to take up the offering?" Or, "Can you teach me how to do obviously sound?" Or, "Can you teach me how to sing or play guitar at the church?" There are also ways to just go up to someone and say, "Hey, I'd love to hear your story. Like, could you share what's one piece of wisdom that you have to share with me?" Often those smaller conversations are what lead to longer lasting relationships. And while my church has once or twice before started official mentoring programs, oftentimes just being, and obviously it can be a little bit difficult sometimes, but being outgoing enough to go up to somebody and just say, "Hey, like, can I hear your story?" Or, "Hey, what's your opinion on this? What's some advice you'd like to give me in this area?" Or, "Hey, you made really good cake at the potluck the other day. Could you teach me how to make that sometimes?" I think more often than not, a lot of people are willing to be in that situation, but as you mentioned, they're not quite sure how to do that and how to get into that position. But I think that would be something that our churches could really consider trying to identify as like a culture shift almost that needs to happen. So I'm not quite sure how to do that, but it would be something that I'd be really keen to see change in the future.
And I guess more people that are aware of this idea, this is one step to have a conversation about it. I don't think I ever heard about mentoring even as a concept growing up. It just wasn't something that was talked about. When you look back at your life, you're like, oh, actually it did happen. There were people that invested in me, that had conversations as a young person attending church. Like, they cared enough to know my name. They cared enough to build a relationship and to have a conversation, to involve me in certain things and give me opportunities to be up the front and make an announcement or practice or whatever. I look back and I go, well, actually it did happen, but potentially being aware of it, I think, and being more intentional about it can actually solve a lot of the problems, because often it happens in a haphazard sort of accidental way, you could almost say. But what if we had a church full of different generations who were actually looking out for opportunities to mentor and to be mentored, and we were fostering some of those relationships? I was actually reflecting with a friend the other day. We've both been a part of church plants at different points and sort of young groups of people, and we were both sort of saying there was just one or two older individuals from different cultural backgrounds, quite a lot more senior than everyone else in the church. But what an important part of the church plant sort of group that person became, just as the elder statesman, as a bit of wisdom, a bit of experience, just a different perspective on certain things, and actually having that intergenerational experience and seeing that, I've seen it firsthand that, hey, that's a really important thing. So I think you've hit the nail on the head with that one. Just before we wrap up, and we are running out of time, this has been a really fascinating conversation today, but do you have anything you'd like to leave with us in a nutshell? Like, what's the core of it, or something we can even do this week that we can start putting into practice that'll just give us a head start on this thing, just get us thinking more intentionally about some of this stuff?
I think something I can struggle with sometimes is coming up or seeing a concept like mentorship and trying to implement it on like a full church scale. Like, all right, we need a fully fledged mentorship program to run every week. My encouragement would be, no matter what age you are, whether you're 85, whether you're 40, whether you're 21, or whether you're 7, whatever age you are, there is always somebody in the church younger than you that you are able to identify and mentor. And so you don't need to go back to your church board. You can, but while you don't have to go back to your church board and say, we need a full-fledged mentorship program. You actually can just say, who is one person or two people in my church that I identify that are younger than me that I can walk alongside? And it doesn't even need to be inviting them to join you in any particular space. It can be, who can I walk alongside, invite to walk alongside me, and really build that relationship with. And again, that's something that anyone of any age can do. And I really encourage, particularly our older generations, as well as our quite younger generations, both to really consider the way that they can find somebody in their church to do that for.
I think that's awesome advice. And I think you're a good role model of that. I don't know how old you are, but I'm guessing you're late 20s or something. But yeah. Yeah, awesome. No, I think that's awesome, Olivia. I think that's great advice. No matter what age you are, you can always mentor someone else. And yeah, like we said before, you don't have to be in a particular role. You don't have to be super famous or popular. You can just be anyone. So yeah, take that encouragement with you. And yeah, thank you for sharing with us, Olivia, what you're passionate about. We've really enjoyed this conversation. And everyone else, thank you for tuning on to Record Live. We'll see you next week.
Yes, God bless. We've got 2 more, I think, of the year after this, Zanita. So we are wrapping up soon. But we look forward to seeing you all next week. Until then, God bless.